Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, The Way Forward, Evidence and Recommendations for Benefit Sharing Frameworks with Local Communities in the Renewable Energy Sector from an African and Global Perspective. My name is Caroline Navant and I'm the head of the Natural Resources and Just Transition team at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I'm joined today by my colleagues who are supporting me on this webinar, and I'm also joined by a great list of speakers. We know that the world is accelerating on the fight against climate change. And we know that it means that many transition minerals will get off the ground in the next decade. That is putting additional pressure on human rights. But we know we don't have to choose between fighting climate change and protecting human rights. A just energy transition is possible, but it means working towards global greater equality, equity, and justice to support the type of collective action and good faith collaboration between states, businesses, workers, and communities we need to see in place to meet this enormous challenge ahead of us. In our view, there are three essential principles that must be present to underpin a just energy transition from a business and human rights perspective. First, the need to build shared prosperity through new economic business models that better share profits and benefits with all. First, the need to insist on social protection and human rights protection and establishing the duty of care of states and businesses. And finally, the importance of fair negotiations with communities and workers, ensuring that public participation rights are fully realized, that indigenous people's rights to FPIC is protected, and that defenders are not silenced. In recent months and years, we have heard a lot about benefit sharing in the energy transition. This has become a new, renewed focus of attention. But what are we talking about exactly? Are we talking about local value addition? Are we talking about fair and just tax regimes supporting public revenues mobilization? Or are we talking about direct benefits going to communities? Today, we're going to zoom in on direct benefit sharing mechanisms with local communities, which must go beyond voluntary corporate social responsibility efforts by businesses, including co-ownership. And we will aim to unpack three important questions. What are the lessons learned from the mining sector that must inform the development of direct benefit sharing frameworks with communities in the renewable energy sector? What are the drivers of success, risks, and concerns from a community perspective? And finally, what is the role of public regulation in all of that? So today I am joined by a fantastic group of speakers. First, we will hear a keynote from Damilola Olawuyi, member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and its former chair. We will also hear a presentation by Joseph Kibugu, our Africa Regional Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Our panel discussion will then be kicked by reflections from Professor Tumai Murombo, Professor of Law at the Wits University in South Africa. Our great panel then includes Mutuso Dliwayo, Director of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, Yumna Firfari, Managing Director at Towards Uhuru Advisory and Senior Strategic Partner to Inspire, the Initiative for Social Performance in Renewable Energy in South Africa, Nafi Chineri, Africa Director at the Natural Resources Governance Institute, and Ruth Getobai Chagwa, Regional Coordinator at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Following the discussion, we will have 15 minutes, hopefully, for questions. Please type your questions as discussion progresses in the Q&A box. You can also upvote questions there. And our team at the Resource Center will help also answer direct questions to the Resource Center. But without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Damilola Olawuyi, you are a professor and UNESCO chair on environmental law and sustainable development at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. You research and teach in the fields of natural resources, energy, environment, and business and human rights law, with a focus on Africa and the Middle East, areas in which you have published, advised extensively. You have advised the World Bank, UN agencies, governments, multinational corporations, civil society organizations on issues related to business and human rights. You are a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and its former chairperson. In July of last year, 2023, the Working Group published a report on the extractive sector, just transition, and human rights. Damilola, I have two questions for you. How is the discussion on benefit sharing relevant to the business and human rights agenda in the context of the just energy transition? And what should states do to ensure corporate commitments to creating shared prosperity through fairer distributions of benefits to affected communities? Damilola, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for the very kind introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you compliments and greetings from the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And I must start by congratulating the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, especially Caroline and our team, for bringing us together to discuss this important issue. As you may already know, our working group was established in 2011 to promote the effective and comprehensive dissemination as well as implementation of the guiding principles on business and human rights, which we like to refer to as the UNGPs. And the UNGPs, of course, represent the authoritative statement and standard on what responsible states and businesses should do to protect, respect, and fulfill human rights across business operations. And of course, one of the most defining issues of our time is the climate change emergency, which by itself is a human right imperative. As the world navigates this challenge, new and old tensions, of course, surface. And one of those key issues is how to sustain human rights safeguards in the search for transition minerals. As the world tries to transition to cleaner energy sources, global demand for transition minerals, especially copper, lithium, nickel, phosphate, manganese, cobalt, zinc, and other rare earth metals, as well as materials such as balsa wood, many of which are found in Africa, have become in high demand. And studies show that these minerals, the demand for these minerals are expected to increase fivefold. Now, if demand increased by 5, we also anticipate that conflict and instability relating to these minerals may also increase fivefold or more. And we already see evidence of such increasing conflict related to transition minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo, even in Niger Republic, as well as in some parts of Nigeria, where I'm from. And this is because a good percentage of transition minerals needed to power the energy transition are often located in conflict-affected and high-risk regions with already pre-existing challenges. In particular, indigenous peoples tend to be disproportionately affected as a result of this search. And that's because half of the world's reserve of transition minerals are often located near or in indigenous lands. So the challenge for us is to ensure that the unprecedented acceleration in the deployment of renewable energy does not replicate or create new forms of human rights violations. The energy transition drive must be consistent with the obligations of states, as well as the commitment of states to the realization of all human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the realization of SDG 13 on climate change, mitigation and adaptation, as well as the Paris Agreement. And as Caroline mentioned, just last year, our working group presented to the General Assembly a report titled Extractive Sector, Just Transition and Human Rights. And I was in New York to deliver this report to the General Assembly. The report is available online in all UN languages. And I will really recommend that you download this report because it explores factors leading to human rights abuses in the context of the energy transition and what states, businesses, and all other stakeholders can do to address those power imbalances, fragmented and inconsistent regulatory frameworks on net zero and energy transition, which may worsen and exacerbate human rights challenges in local communities. Similarly, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has documented in its Transition Minerals Tracker a very useful and helpful resource showing that more than 600 allegations of abuses associated with the extraction of bauxite, cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc have occurred since 2010. So I think you will all agree that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights have never been more relevant. There is a need for all of us to take steps to realize some of the statements and principles in the UNGPs. How can we ensure that the transition does not lead to the situation whereby businesses place profit above people and above planet? How can we ensure that all due diligence policies and practices are in place and implemented to advance human rights? Of course, the energy transition also presents an opportunity for us to build just economies that will deliver better human rights respecting outcomes. And of course, only by ensuring that a fair redistribution and benefits and burdens of the energy transition, only by ensuring also that the energy transition, respects and fulfills the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and their businesses. It is only by doing this that we can really, really achieve a just energy transition. And that is why today's webinar is very important. Benefit sharing is at the heart of a just energy transition. Of course, when we then say benefit sharing, the definition is often contested. What does it really mean? Is it the concept or responsibility of different actors, have come up rather with different definitions based on their own circumstances, which often leaves the notion of benefit sharing to greenwashing or abusive corporate practices. But of course, the idea of benefit sharing is not new in international law. It's just about reiterating what it should mean in the context of the just energy transition. And I hope this webinar will lead us close to that. For example, benefit sharing is embedded in the 1989 ILO Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention number 169, which provides that indigenous and tribal peoples, and I quote, shall, whenever, wherever possible, participate in the benefits arising from the exploration and exploitation of natural resources pertaining to their lands, end of quote. So the idea of benefit sharing is just ensuring the fair and equitable distribution of benefits arising from the exploration and exploitation of natural resources arising from indigenous lands. People living in the immediate vicinity of large infrastructure projects, especially indigenous peoples, often discuss the need for community benefit agreements. So how to ensure that those agreements indeed represent the aspirations of the indigenous communities, how to ensure that they are fair, they are comprehensive, and they are implemented with all transparency are the key issues. And of course, in the interest of time, I will reiterate 5 key ways in which we can achieve these triple wins in the energy transition. Triple wins of community benefit sharing, a situation whereby 3 things happen, where communities and workers gain tangible benefits, environmental protection, and control over all these projects in their territories. A situation whereby investors and companies gain more stable and conducive investment environment, and a situation whereby our planet gains rapid transition action towards reestablishing a stable planet. If we can achieve these 3, then it will be the triple win. Win for the planet, win for peoples, and of course, win in terms of a new corporate culture whereby investments are sustainable and advance human rights. And to achieve these triple wins, I think there are 5 key takeaway messages for states. Number 1 is the need to include this community benefit sharing in comprehensive frameworks relating to, when we are licensing projects in the first place, whether we're talking of mining projects or we're talking of, investment, there is, number 1, a need to integrate human rights safeguards, mandatory human rights due diligence in a gender-responsive way. And this will include ensuring that projects are only licensed and approved when they demonstrate that human rights due diligence has been conducted. I think by so doing, we will be reinforcing human rights norms in the approval of projects. Number 2, in the context of projects proposed on indigenous people's land, there is a need to ensure that there is a legal recognition in national regulatory frameworks that mandates the respect for indigenous rights, especially free, prior, informed consent in the process of developing such projects. And number 3 is the need to ensure that the existing power asymmetries, both internal and external, are not further entrenched in direct benefit sharing models in local communities. So need to address some of those pre-existing power imbalances and ensure that the energy transition addresses them and does not replicate them. And of course, number 4 is the need for ensuring capacity building capacity of local communities to negotiate fair contracts, building capacity of key stakeholders in ministries to be able to negotiate both legally, technically, and financially, building their capacity to be able to achieve fairer deals that are not lopsided and will not replicate human rights abuse. Last but not the least is the need for transparency, building, which is very key to build corporate accountability. Agreements must be fair and they must be publicly accessible to all so that we can see and we can easily raise questions when investment agreements or mining agreements may replicate pre-existing human rights problems. Of course, these 5 points are just to lay the ground. I'm sure some of our experts here will be able to delve into them on how we can strengthen human rights safeguard in the search for transition minerals and how we can ensure transparent and accountable benefit sharing along the way. And of course, there is a need to sustain industrial awareness in this discussion as we go on. There's a need to ensure that frontline officers and boards in businesses are indeed educated and are aware of some of these emerging norms in order to ensure that human rights is effectively mainstreamed. And as a working group, we remain at your disposal to support such capacity development and sustain dialogue. And let me take this opportunity to reiterate that we look forward to seeing you all at our upcoming annual forum on business and human rights in Geneva, which is happening in the last week of November. As you may know, the theme for this year is realizing the smart mix of measures to protect human rights in the context of business activities. And the issue of benefit sharing will be at the center stage. I also take this opportunity to welcome you to join us for this year's African Business and Human Rights Forum, which will happen from 8 to 10 October 2024 in Nairobi, Kenya. It will be a great opportunity to further discuss the issue of benefit sharing in the African context. Let me end by again congratulating the entire Business and Human Rights Resource Center team for your continued dedication to capacity development in this area. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Damilola, and thank you so much for being with us and for those very important reflections. You made it very clear that we have to be very precise when we're talking about benefit sharing, and we need to really unpack what it means and what the definition can be. And you also pointed out to the responsibility of the state in providing the right enabling regulatory framework. We recently conducted research on lessons learned from benefit sharing regulatory frameworks in 6 African countries, looking at the mining and renewable energy sector that we just published on Tuesday of this week. So I will now turn to Joe Kibugu, our Africa Regional Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Joe, could you share a few key findings from this recent research? If you could highlight 3 key points you want our audience to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline. And yes, as Caroline has said, we recently published a briefing titled From Mining to Renewable Energy, Lessons Learned from Benefit Sharing Legislation in for Just Transition in Africa. And we looked at how benefit sharing legislation has panned out in 6 countries, that is Tanzania, Ghana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, and Sierra Leone. And these countries are crucial in the global transition to renewable energy. For instance, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania for their transitional minerals potential, and South Africa and Kenya, on the other hand, for the potential and actual renewable energy installations that are going on. Now, a few words about the methodology. We based the report on literature review, legal research led by one of the panelists, interviews from local experts that included legal practitioners, scholars, policy advisors, paralegals, and those that are supporting communities if affected by mining and renewable energy installations. Now, three points as asked by my colleague. One is that the urgency of the transition in the global north, and in case of African countries, many and the global south, in many places we don't talk about a transition, is basically to bridge the power, the reliable energy gap. It means that the demand for transitional minerals will continue to grow, and the renewable energy installations will continue to be seen as one viable way of bridging that gap. However, business needs to be conducted differently, and we need to move beyond CSR and compensation to where individuals and communities that are affected by the transition can meaningfully benefit. The briefing discussed different ways in which this has been done, and this forms part of the case studies. For instance, in some countries, we talk of community development agreements. In others, community development funds. In others, we've got co-ownership agreements between communities and companies. And the last one is where local communities benefit from the revenue generated by corporations and use of land use by corporations to get direct benefits. The second one is a strong case that we can no longer rely on voluntariness as a basis of benefit sharing. So the briefing makes a strong case for the need to regulate, to make sure that this is mandatory. Because voluntary initiatives have not translated to meaningful material advantage for those that are impacted. Sierra Leone, for instance, has led the way by enacting legislation that guarantees the right to community consent in industrial projects. So basically what we are saying is that clear frameworks for community benefit sharing in both upstream and downstream, here I mean mining and renewable energy sectors, need to be thought about going beyond government's social and economic obligations. And then finally, apart from regulation, we need to support communities, or communities needs to be supported both technically and financially so that they can monitor these benefit sharing agreements. And this includes those who have been traditionally marginalized from this conversation, whether it is women, indigenous peoples, youth, and other groups. And they need to be involved at every stage. Therefore, both governments and communities need to be capacitated, both technically and financially, to be able to monitor these frameworks. I rest my case there, and if you have not, again, read the report, it's available on our site and appearing currently on our homepage. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Joe. And yeah, maybe someone can copy the link to the report in the chat for participants. But many thanks, Joe. I think you insisted on the need to conduct businesses in a different manner when we are looking at the energy transition, looking at minerals, but also looking at renewable energy fast deployment, and also the need to center the needs and aspirations of local communities and capacitate them. But before we hear reactions and also lived experiences from our panelists, there's another important framing question that I want to ask to you, Professor Tumai Morombo. You are a professor of law at Wits University in South Africa with a research interest on renewable energy, extractives, climate change, and just transition. You have been researching regulatory frameworks around benefit sharing. Could you share your reflections on them and possibly around the articulation between legally binding requirements on one hand and voluntary initiatives on the other? Is there a better option? Professor Morombo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and good afternoon or morning, colleagues and fellow researchers. The question of benefit sharing and the design of appropriate frameworks remains, in my view, and based on the research that I've been doing, a complex process. I'm glad that Prof. Olawi has shared some of the work that is happening internationally to try to give explicit, legally binding scope and force to these frameworks, at least to provide foundational principles on the basis of which states and citizens can hold corporates accountable for their activities as they try to rush into the critical energy minerals and to transition their corporate activities. But given the long history of benefit sharing frameworks, as indicated by our previous speakers, one finds that there are various different models that have been designed. Some are built on legal foundations. Some are legally binding and mandated, whether it's in mining or extractives legislation or laws, or whether they are found in transformation or empowerment legislation. We have found that there are various approaches. You also find approaches that have evolved from corporate social responsibility initiatives. These are not enforceable, not legally binding, and they're driven by the priorities and goals of corporate actors. So you find that in the corporate space, beyond these CSR initiatives, there are also emerging trends where corporate regulatory frameworks are also driving benefit sharing and community participation in the extraction of resources. So, for example, you have listing requirements. Increasingly, we are also seeing corporates moving towards environmental, social, and governance policy development and reporting, part of which includes the reporting on how their work is protecting the rights of communities in the areas in which they operate, and how their work and activities are benefiting local communities. So that remains largely voluntary, sustainability reporting, ESG, but it is giving some benefits to some communities, although not legally binding. So the impact of these approaches, whether they are legally binding, whether they are voluntary or driven by corporate initiatives, or whether they are part of multi-stakeholder initiatives, there are many factors that determine their effectiveness in achieving the UNGB principles, for example, or in promoting the upholding of human rights when mining companies are operating. Some of these factors they're outlined in the report that has been produced by the Business and Human Rights Resources Center. But just to highlight some of the key foundational frameworks that are important for the success of whether legally binding or even voluntary initiatives. I think there is need for a strong rule of law culture, strong institutions for transparency and accountability, as has been pointed out. If you have legally binding frameworks for benefit sharing, that in itself or by itself is insufficient to promote effective and meaningful participation by the communities or sharing in the benefits of the resource extraction. It means that beyond legally binding frameworks, you need other procedural, constitutional guarantees that can enable communities to enforce the rights that are guaranteed in these legal frameworks. Therefore, in countries or regimes where the rule of law is weak, where the institutional culture is weak, and where communities do not have other rights, even legally binding frameworks are not sufficient to promote the objectives of human rights due diligence and benefit sharing. This is the space where one finds that in some countries, community benefit sharing arrangements driven by the corporations have been better in achieving meaningful results than legally binding instruments. So you find that, for example, some of the legally binding structures, like the community benefit sharing agreements in Kenya, They are state-driven, and they are designed around public officials playing a role in the structures, which may sometimes exclude communities, hence leading to negative outcomes or negative results. So I think the effectiveness of legally binding benefit sharing arrangements depends on other factors, the constitutional framework, the rule of law, good governance, and the like. So, and voluntary initiatives, while they are not sufficient by themselves, and while we need to move towards maybe creating some legal framework to make them binding, they have achieved some results to date, although they remain unenforceable against corporations. But I think some progress has been made, both globally and in some of the countries that the case studies are focused on. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those very important points. And I think, you know, you insisted on the fact that legally binding mechanisms don't always necessarily result in effective benefits going to communities, and that is an important reflections. Well, I will now turn to our great panelists to share their reflections. I want to turn now first to our first panelist, Mutuso Dliwayo. Mutuso, you're a lawyer and the executive director of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA. Your research and advocacy interests are in climate change, energy governance, business and human rights, and the extractive industry at the national, regional, and international level, with a particular focus on Chinese investments in Zimbabwe. Mutuso, could you share, based on your experience in Zimbabwe and ZELA's experience, what has been the lived experience of communities engaging in such mechanisms? And could you share one experience you have had defending a community? The floor is yours, Mutuso. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good afternoon or good morning to you all, depending on where you are joining us from. Thanks very much for inviting me to this panel, which is speaking to very important issues or very important matters when it comes to critical minerals. So as the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, we have experience working with communities to get benefits from mining. Well, it may not necessarily be critical minerals, but the experience has been broad, including critical minerals and non-critical minerals. So our first point is that communities are a key stakeholder, and they should also derive benefits from the exploitation of these resources. So people, that is government and the private sector, are into mining because there are some benefits there that are to be met. So the challenge is that more often than not, it is the government and the private sector that wants to get benefits from the exploitation of these resources at the expense of communities. Yet communities, as I've indicated, are also an important stakeholder. So what we have been advocating for is for these shared benefits, so that communities don't just see the costs that are associated with mining, but not deriving the benefits. Of course, mining has costs, but they should also be able to get benefits from the exploitation of those mineral resources. And once that happens, then we can then begin to talk about having these shared values, shared benefits, which is what we are all advocating for. I think for me, before I share our experience, let me quote from the experiences of or the remarks that were made by the UN Secretary General when he was constituting the UN panel on critical minerals. He noted that the race to the net zero economy can not tremble over the poor. The renewables revolution is happening, but we must guide it towards justice. And I think in his speech, he made a lot of reference to keywords like equity, transparency, and sustainability, and human rights as well. And I think this is where the communities also become relevant. So from our perspective, we have worked with the communities, we have defended their rights to derive benefits from the exploitation of resources that are found within their localities, whether they are critical minerals or not critical minerals. But how do we do this? So first and foremost is training and capacity building. I think one of the panelists also made the reference to that. Communities should be able to understand how the exploitation of these resources affect their rights. whether it is their environmental rights, whether it is their economic rights, social and cultural rights. How are they impacted by the extraction of these resources? So for us, that becomes very critical, that capacity building, and then followed by awareness raising so that they're aware to say, based on the existing laws and policies, or even those frameworks that Professor Mrombo was making reference to, how can they benefit? How can they participate and derive benefits, meaningful benefits from those laws and policies that are there? So once you do that, if they are aware of their rights, you build their capacities, then it sets the stage for them to begin to claim their benefits or to claim their rights and even enforce them or even demand them. And maybe this now takes me to the issues of remedies. So if they don't get those benefits, what remedies are available for them to claim them? Then, of course, there are also other opportunities that could be there to try and influence the laws and policies themselves. So when these laws and policies are being made, I mean, there were reference to those community development agreements, the Sierra Leone laws, and when it comes to Zimbabwe, under the Indigenization and Economic Empowerment Act, there are also some provisions that were made there. So it is also very important for them to participate in those policy and decision-making process, those legal reforms that may be able to provide for those benefits that they should be able to derive in the exploitation of those resources. So when you put all that as a basket to say you have built their capacities, they are aware how the exploitation of these resources affect their rights, they know the remedies that are available, they are able to participate in the policy and decision-making processes, they are able to have access to their representatives, whether it is at the local level or also at the national level. That in itself begin to constitute what we can call a basket of issues that can now be used to defend the rights of the communities, to build their capacity to engage in benefit sharing. And we've seen that happening a lot. But building their capacities to engage and knowing that there are benefits is one thing. But when those benefits begin to come, I think it's also another level that may need to be looked into to make sure that even among those communities themselves, then there's equity in terms of how those benefits are shared. Because we've also had the experiences in the diamond mining sector where we fought hard for the communities to right, to benefit, to be recognized. And when those resources were now made available in terms of the benefits, we also saw that resulting in some serious squabbles among community members in terms of benefits. And then they begin to marginalize each other in terms of benefits instead of sharing those benefits equitable. So there are a lot of levels that are there in terms of making sure that communities are able to benefit from these resources that are exploited within their localities. As a professor there has pointed out, these resources are extracted in their homelands, in their traditional homelands, and it is them that suffer in terms of the exploitation. So it is also equally right that they are also able to derive benefits from these resources when those resources are exploited. So yes, we have had those experiences and we've participated in legal reforms, we've built their capacities, we've trained them, and we've also litigated to make sure that they get access to remedies, which may include benefits. So those are our experiences as an organization. I know that there are also a lot of other initiatives that are ongoing that are related to the just energy transition in terms of benefits, like the Just Energy Transition Africa. Again, that's another mechanism that is there that can actually ensure that communities are able to derive benefits from the exploitation of these resources. So with those, I rest my case and I look forward to engaging further on how best we can improve the regulatory frameworks to make sure that communities benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mutuso. And yeah, I mean, you insisted on the need to capacitate communities, on the need to make sure that in the energy transition, they don't only see the cost, but that they also see the benefits. And that is absolutely critical in Zimbabwe, where as you have mentioned, there's significant extraction of lithium in particular. But I want to also look a little bit at what's happening at the other end of renewable energy value chain in the installation of renewable energy projects. And we'll turn now to our next panel member, Yumna Firfere. Yumna, you are the Managing Director of Towards Uru Advisory and Senior Strategic Partner to Inspire, the Initiative for Social performance and renewable energy in South Africa, where your work spans across the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, advocating and building capacity for better social performance practice and scalable projects in Southern Africa. With your very diverse experience in business, government, as an entrepreneur, and in establishing partnerships with organizations in a variety of sectors, including renewable energy, could you share a little bit on the practice of benefit sharing from the perspective of renewable energy companies in South Africa, including community shareholding in these utility-scale renewable energy projects? How can we make such models mutually beneficial for businesses and communities? And what are the drivers of success and what are the risks? Yumna, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. If we look at benefit sharing in South Africa, where there is a mandatory, comprehensive, regulated framework in place provided by our government's REAP program, we've got to ask the question, is it working? And yes, to some extent it is working, but it has the potential to do so much more. And this is actually the raison d'etre of Inspire, to expand the current social performance practice into that full potential of social contributions that actually can transform communities and change lives. And in South Africa, we have the full spectrum of IPPs, independent power producers, from those who see benefit sharing or these regulations and contributions towards these regulations as a tax. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have business leaders who see the full vision of how impactful these socioeconomic SED contributions can be and how they can allow IPPs to contribute towards the creation of stable, thriving communities surrounding their plants with capacitated, competent, reliable suppliers and a workforce. And by doing this, they see the vision of, by doing this, they'll decrease uncertainty, they'll decrease the cost of doing business in the long term. And then also continuing from a purely business perspective, they see that if they do this, they decrease the probability of risk of protest action. So in South Africa, we've got the full spectrum of IPPs, from tax to those who see the full vision. And I think we've got to ask ourselves, what are the pitfalls and risks then that have to be solved for? So when we have the IPPs who see these contributions as a tax, then there's a very good chance that they aren't supporting their social performance departments. And that might be, in the form of affirmation, not affirming the work that they're doing, or not giving them the adequate resources to have the size and strength of departments to be able to do this work properly. And then they might also not be encouraging interdepartmental support. And what I mean by this is the inclusion of supply chain inclusion, supplier development, and all the other kinds of support programs and interdepartmental support that makes this not just a PR program or a CSI pet project, but actually makes it a real social performance program. And this could happen either in the operations phase or in the very lucrative construction phase of renewable energy projects, where there are lots of jobs created, lots of business opportunities to be had. So when companies see it as a tax, they're not able to support all of these activities. And when they are not supporting social performance functions, people in those functions who are often very passionate about what they do work harder to be able to achieve the desired outcomes that they'd like to see within a framework in their organizations that is not very supportive and not very conducive. So they are working very hard because they want to do really good work. They want to change lives, and they work harder and harder to be able to see the results. And then the other layer, that's an interesting layer to add on top of this, is that most often in South Africa, in these IPPs, these social performance practitioners are women. And most often they are Black people. So there we've got another layer of understanding of people who've got to work really hard to be able to prove their worth and to win acceptance. And when you're on this non-stop treadmill of program implementation, delivery, and spending these socioeconomic contributions, it's very rare that you find the time to be able to be strategic and to be able to collaborate with peers in the industry and then also other social development partners to make strategic socioeconomic development investments, even though you really want to and you know that you need to. So that's some of the realities. What are the potential drivers of success? And this is part of Inspire's work, is largely the business transition. And what do we mean by the business transition? It's the shifting of corporate practices to prioritizing human rights in all operations and supply chain. And then in a renewable context, actually, we've written a book called Powerful Futures that talks about this business transition. And Powerful Futures, it's going to be launched next month. It's a book that Inspire has co-authored with our like-minded partners in what we call the Global South Alliance for a Just Transition to Renewable Energy. Just RE. And this is constituted by like-minded partners in Mexico, Colombia, India, Philippines, and Kenya. And our partner, just interestingly enough, our partner in the Philippines is the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in the Philippines. And in chapter 4 of the book on effective community engagement, our book refers to a different business mindset as a key driver towards equitable benefit sharing. Some of the key things that we're looking at as examples is aligning incentives and key performance indicators of executives to social performance, because often these executives don't stay in a company long enough to see the results of their poor or good investment decisions in social performance and might instead be rewarded for minimizing costs and increasing short-term profits. The other example that we offer in the book is to quantify the costs to the company of inadequate benefit sharing, because when you are not costing good social performance, good community engagement in your model, in your business model and in your financial model, these costs of not doing it creep up on you later. And often it costs more later on to fix a bad foundation than to actually set a good foundation up in the first place. So that impacts on your long-term profits. Those are some of the suggestions that we give in our book. And if we think about the fact that in South Africa, these power purchase and many other parts of the world, these power purchase agreements span 20 years, you have the opportunity to set these foundations and actually reap the rewards later on. So there is a business case for doing this properly. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about community ownership. And again, in South Africa, we have a regulated requirement for community ownership of host communities around a power plant as part of the REAP program. But I think rather than asking the question, is it working? I think a more valuable question to ask would be, what really is community ownership? Is it shareholding? Is it deriving dividends from a profitable renewables plant? Or is it instead utilizing the vehicle of the power plant or of the community trust that has a share in the power plant to bring about transformational change? And that transformational change can be growth and progress in community agency, community leadership, skill, decision-making ability, active inclusion in socioeconomic development, and control of a collective future. And I think if it's the latter, then we shouldn't try to solve merely for shareholding in the form of a share certificate or in the trickle of dividends. What we should rather be doing, and this is what we've managed to do, or we're busy doing through Inspire, we've received some funding through South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, who provides the equity for many of these community trusts, or the funding, the share funding for these community trusts, is we've put in place a trust maturity framework that looks at the aspects of regulation, capacity, vision and strategy, and impactful delivery, with lots of subcomponents under each of these, so that in this way we can look at how we make community trusts more engaging, more participative, more inclusive, and more impactful. And a key catalyst is putting communities at the center of community trust through the enhanced inclusion of community trustees and of the community, and from operating in a strategic, systemic, and a collaborative outlook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yumna. Thank you for sharing your experience with Inspire. And I think, you know, like what you have highlighted about the need to change the corporate mindset and put human rights at the heart of business. And I think you made a pretty strong business case. So thank you for that. But you also alluded and talked about the responsibility of the regulatory framework and the regulated requirements in South Africa as one of the key in the transformation. So I want to turn now to our third panelist, Nafi Chineri. Nafi, you are the Africa Director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and you focus on energy transition minerals, and revenue management, working with communities, civil society organizations, and governments across the continent to ensure the energy transition in Africa is one that is inclusive, equitable, accountable, aligned with Africa's reality and promoting development. And you're based in Ghana. You have a lot of experience engaging with governments across the continent on policy reforms issue in the mining sector. And Energy is also one of the two civil society organizations on the UNSG-led panel looking at critical energy transition minerals with the view to ensure countries and citizens can benefit from their extraction. Can I ask you to share with us what do you think are the critical principles that must underpin government actions in supporting effective benefit sharing frameworks? Thank you, Nafi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for the invitation. First of all, to ensure that the mineral resources benefit citizens and then support a stable energy transition, it is imperative to implement significant changes, upholding human rights and equitable benefit sharing mechanism. And therefore, NRGI's President, Sunita Kemal, as a member of the UN panel on the critical energy transition minerals, made recommendations drawn from this and also from NRGI's extensive experience and research across the globe, and particularly in Africa, where the governance of transition minerals is crucial for sustainable development and social justice. And I'm pleased to hear from all the different speakers about the commonality in the ideas and the recommendations that we also shared with at the panel. So first and foremost, upholding transparency and accountability was quite high on the agenda, on our agenda of recommendations. That governments must ensure transparency in all mining stages, and I think that colleagues from Zella and the university have also mentioned same. And that's from contract negotiation to revenue management. We need to ensure transparency, and this involves publicly disclosing contracts, payments, and revenue flow to prevent corruption and mismanagement. We need to implement robust transparency mechanisms like the EITI initiatives, ensuring all stakeholders, including local communities, have access to relevant information. I think that the work that Zella is doing is quite apt on this. And so countries like Ghana and Tanzania have made significant strides in adherence to the EITI, but that's not, there's still a gap. We need to go the next step. So second was also the need for inclusivity and participation. You know, so effective, and as we've heard also from the other speakers, that effective benefit sharing frameworks require that the inclusion of all relevant stakeholders, especially local communities and marginalized groups. Their participation should be meaningful and not just tokenistic, right? We need to move away from the way things are done in the past. We need to establish, so the need to establish platforms for regular consultations and dialogue with communities, civil society, and other non-state actors adhering to EITI and FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent requirements, recognizing really the rights of indigenous communities. And just the previous speaker talked about the South African experience, the mining charter mandates that mining companies engage with communities and provide social economic benefits, ensuring local voices are considered. Of course, she also alluded to that there are gaps that we need to improve on those, but those are some examples that could be replicated and improved. The whole issue about equity and fairness, it's key, and it has also come out from this discussions that benefit sharing frameworks should promote equitable distribution of benefits, addressing power imbalances and ensuring benefits reach those most affected by resource extraction activities. So developing and enforcing legal frameworks that mandate equitable distribution of resources. And in this case, Botswana has an example, so Botswana's management of the diamond revenue through the Botswana Unified Revenue Service and investment in public goods serve as a model for equitable distribution. Of course, look at it and how do we improve it and build on that framework. So the legal issues others have also spoken about. So legal and institutional frameworks. How do we create a business-friendly environment for a triple win, a win-win situation for government, investors, and communities? So strengthening the legal frameworks and prevent corruption by defining clear rules, responsibilities, rights related to benefit sharing, and support capacity building. It came out also strongly of institutions responsible for overseeing and implementing these frameworks. And in this case, the example from Rwanda mining sector that has benefited from targeted capacity building initiative. There's also Zambia's revised Mines and Mineral Development Act, which also seeks to create a more equitable legal environment for mining. These are key. Value addition. We need to move away from where raw materials are extracted from Africa and other places and denying these countries of the benefits of their mineral wealth. So developing local industries and processing capabilities, would allow countries to retain a larger share of their value generated from their mineral resources. And this can boost economic growth, creating jobs, building local expertise. And Africa's rich deposits of transition minerals like lithium and cobalt offer a unique opportunity to enter into the high-value battery production. Environmental and social sustainability issues key, enforce strict environmental and social standards to protect ecosystems and ensure mining activities do not harm local livelihoods. Implement robust ESG frameworks and could mitigate risk and ensure mining activities contribute positively to communities' well-being and environmental preservation. The whole issue of local content and economic diversification, again, come out. Provide local content policies that encourage the use of local labor, goods and services, and foster economic diversification. We have a case in Nigeria's Local Content Act in the oil and gas sector that provides a blueprint for similar policies. Of course, and again, I'd like to highlight that there are gaps, but at least something has been put in place that can be built upon, reviewed, and improved upon. Regional cooperation and integration. Manage resources effectively through regional cooperation and integration, especially as many of the mineral deposits span borders, and our work really at the regional level shows some kind of hindrances. So the African Mining Vision, endorsed by the Africa Union, promotes regional cooperation for continent development. We need to ensure that this is really implemented. The challenge really is about implementation gap across board. The issue of human rights and social justice, I can't emphasize that enough as one of the recommendations. All the speakers have talked about it, ensuring mining activities do not violate human rights and that affected communities are fairly compensated and resettled where necessary. And we've seen efforts in Uganda to improve the resettlement process for communities displayed by mining projects. And this highlights the importance of fairness and justice. And so in terms of policy, we need to ensure policy coherence. And I think that the last speaker also talked about it, where we are aligning benefit sharing policies with broader national development goals. And I think they went a step further by tying it to the executive, which I think is quite innovative and something that we need to look into. And sectoral policies related to land, environment, and social welfare. So I think I would end here, but just to say that finally, we need to navigate this pivotal moment in the global energy transition. It is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that the governance of critical transition minerals is underpinned by principles of transparency, inclusivity, equity, and sustainability. Hopefully, these recommendations for the principles will be strongly considered at the UN level, because adhering to these principles, we believe African governments can create benefit sharing frameworks that not only maximize economic benefits for critical energy transition mining, but also ensures these benefits are shared equitably, sustainably, and justly among all citizens. At NRGI, we are very committed to supporting these efforts and ensuring that resource wealth translates into meaningful development and social justice for all. And thanks very much, Carol and team.
Thank you so much, Nati. And I think you made a pretty strong case for further international cooperation on benefit sharing. But I also noted that you insisted on transparency and accountability, which are two important principles for strong regulatory frameworks around benefit sharing. But also you mentioned the need to strengthen the legal framework, which was mentioned by other speakers, but also the need for policy coherence. And I think that's also absolutely key, and looking at the protection of human rights to mechanisms to distribute benefits. I want to turn now, with that in mind, to our fourth and last panel member, Ruth Getobai-Chagwa. Ruth, you are a human rights and gender specialist and currently the regional coordinator at Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Kenya is seeing rapidly increasing investment in renewable energy, and you have been engaging in public and private renewable energy companies on their human rights due diligence. As you have heard from our speakers and from our research, states and policy coherence have a key role to play in creating the conditions for effective benefit sharing. Looking at Kenya in particular, and from your perspective, what do you think should be done to ensure that communities meaningfully get a fair share of benefits? Ruth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to all the panelists for the very informative discussions. So to start off, first of all, I think that benefit sharing is quite a thorny issue because corporations or communities lack capacity to value their resource. So first of all, the starting point should be that communities are capacitated to properly value their resource. And this is a window for both local and national governments to ensure that communities really understand the valuation of their resource, both currently and futuristic. Because what we see are one of CSR initiatives being tailored to communicate that it is a form of benefit sharing, yet communities then are being left without meaningful without meaningful benefit sharing. Also, to note that, especially where there are renewable energy installations, are regions that have suffered systemic neglect and marginalization. So I think it would be important that both corporates and the governments should consider, first of all, looking at the historical injustices that those communities hosting the resources have underwent. It may not necessarily be underpinned in any legal framework, but first of all, acknowledging that these communities have suffered historical injustices and marginalization, and therefore there are some aspects or there are some benefits that they should be given even before the resource itself should be exploited. And for instance, we know there have been instances where communities are hosting, for instance, geothermal projects, power is being generated, yet they're living in darkness. They're not even connected to the national grid, and therefore it should be important that such instances, the communities hosting that particular resource are the first beneficiaries, for instance, of such power generated, and also given what we call given preferential power tariffs so that they can feel part and parcel of it. I know benefit sharing is still a thorny issue, and even where we have legal frameworks, we still have gaps. And I think I come from a point of thought that this should be explored from a hybrid approach, whereby we have strong legal and policy frameworks, but at the same time be open to admit any locally bred mechanisms that look at their own issues at the local level and addresses them at their local levels, and only taps into the legal frameworks where necessary. Because as there's a speaker who had spoken earlier, noted that there are instances where, yes, we have the frameworks, they have been put in place, but the involvement of national or local authorities then also sort of is quite challenging, because they don't just come in with the interest of the communities, they come in with their own interests. So to some extent, then it's good, yes, to have a legal framework that apportions a responsibility to the local and or local authorities, but also gives room for communities to come up with their own locally bred mechanisms. And these mechanisms also should be free from the aspect of gatekeeping by, let's say, the committee members or the community leaders who sort of negotiate things that are not really what the community wants. So it should be meaningful participation while engaging both women, the youth, the elderly, to see that all their interests are taken care of. I'd like to also mention that there is a problem when we talk about benefit sharing, especially where information is not fully disclosed and people are not even aware what they're getting into. Communities are not aware what they're getting into. For instance, recently I was handling a case where a gentleman had given his land to a renewable energy company, and they agreed that he was going to have minimum loss of land. But when the operations began, then him and some villagers have had total land loss. But then when you dig deeper into the issues, you realize that there was no full disclosure of information because some of these companies do not operate on their own. There are other subcontracted companies, which then communities need to be told to understand what they're getting into, what this resource is going to help, especially when we are talking about generating and powering the country, but also communicate clearly what is in it for them, because some of these contracts are very limited in terms of disclosing the information and allowing the people to sort of give their input. So yes, meaningful participation, meaningful disclosure, full disclosure of information to allow people or communities to make informed decisions, informed agreement, because when they are getting into these agreements, they need to know. So we are not just talking about communities being moved from one place to another to pave way for exploitation of this resource without necessarily looking at how then have they been conserving this resource, for instance, past efforts and the current efforts of these communities to conserve this resource that hasn't been taken care of. So when communities are given a one-off payment, sort of a tokenism, and looking at the communities themselves have been marginalized over the years, they take it. But when you look at the value of the resource, proper valuation of that particular resource, then it means that there needs to be proper, meaningful engagement and discussion and revealing what the benefits should be. And yes, transparency in sharing the benefits from this particular resource. So I agree with the other panelists who have talked about legal frameworks, but also making a room for local bred initiatives that ensure that the resource is well shared by communities, and also taking into consideration the power dynamics within communities, so that we don't leave them worse off. And yes, this is a just transition. So we shouldn't leave communities worse off. We should have an empowered transition whereby communities, in as much as they have given up their resource to allow the resource to be exploited, then they share the prosperity that comes from this particular resource. So we should look at the advantages that the communities are foregoing to pave way for that particular resource to be exploited, and the disturbance that occurs during the exploitation, and take into consideration the future needs of that particular community. And I think I agree with the first speaker who gave us the triple wins of the planet, the peoples, and a new corporate culture, where we are not just talking about compensation, we are talking about benefits. So benefits, if we are going to allow communities to lease off, then that should be discussed. There are various mechanisms, or communities should be allowed also to vary that particular ratio as the exploitation of that resource goes on. And also look at various power dynamics, the intra-gender and intergender dynamics within the particular communities. Because recently I read somewhere that a certain company, because they were negotiating for benefits, they agreed to give some livestock to this particular community. But when you sit down with the particular with the members,
I'm very hi. So Ruth, I'm very, very sorry to jump in, but I just want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. So if I can ask to wrap up, please.
Okay, let me wrap up. Yes. I think I was making my last comment that sorry, I think you have put me off guard.
I'm so sorry.
Let me make my last comment that let me look at my presentation. Yes, that communities shouldn't be left disempowered, that the benefits that they are going to gain from this particular resource being exploited looks at both their current and future needs. And that's why I was agreeing to the first speaker who gave us the triple wins of planet, peoples, and a new corporate culture. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you so much. And I mean, definitely, absolutely agree with all your points on looking at the power dynamics and looking at hybrid model, regulatory frameworks, but also supporting locally bred, as you framed it, in the initiatives. So thank you so much for sharing all those reflections. So we have now reached the end of this webinar. We have 1 minute for questions. Some questions were already answered in the chat, but there's one question that I would like to direct to you, Yumna. So there's argument that, so the question is that there are arguments that making mandatory benefit sharing with communities for companies will deter private investment. will deter private investment. And so there is this argument that this is too cumbersome for the private sector. Would you care to comment about this question? Thank you. And sorry, actually, I will ask right now another question for whoever wants to take it. Another question is: it's already challenging for middle-income countries to meet legal contract commitments, so it's challenging to invite them to do more. What strategy can be used in different countries to go beyond legal due diligence and to support direct benefit sharing for mechanisms? So first question on the private sector for you, Yumna, and the second question on how to push to go beyond legal requirements for all speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe a controversial response. I am not sure whether it does limit companies from investing. If you have a regulations framework that is also conducive and facilitative. So are companies not coming because of the requirements that you put in place, or they're not coming because of other red tape issues or other costs that might be constrictive? So I think we need to be very clear, because I think we've seen that companies are coming. They're coming to invest in countries, even where there are regulations frameworks around benefit sharing. So and then I think we've also got to ask us, and then of course the benefit sharing mechanism has to be win-win to some extent. They've got to be able to get some profit out of it, but they've also got to be able to get some profit out of it for the communities. So it's got to be worthwhile. And then I think for companies who are not interested in investing, if there is benefit sharing, the question is, do you really want those companies, those multinationals in your country? What is the value of investment anyway if it's not going to be improving the quality of lives of people in our country? If it's not going to be creating jobs, not going to be able to include local supplies into supply chains, not going to be training people, not going to be ensuring that people have better education, etc. So I think that's maybe the question that we need to ask ourselves. I hope that answers it, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really insightful. I don't know if anyone wants to answer the second question about like how can we push middle-income countries to go beyond legal requirements when it's already difficult to enforce some of the existing legal requirements. Maybe a question for, I don't know, Nafi, if you want. Sorry to put you on the spot, but.
Yeah, could you please repeat the question again?
So the question is that it's already challenging for middle-income countries to meet legal contract commitments. So it's challenging to invite to go beyond what is already existing. So what are the strategies that can be used to push countries to go beyond legal due diligence and implement direct sharing mechanisms when they are not in place already?
Yeah, I think yes, it will be indeed challenging to go beyond national legal requirements on contracts. I think what's important to do, you need to gather information, new information and right information to inform any review of a country's legal requirements. So you need to look at existing context, and look at projections and make a strong case for a review of contractual obligations and terms and legal requirements. Otherwise, once you have the law, it's difficult to go beyond the law. What is required is, some research analysis to inform a case for a review that will suit both companies and countries and communities. I think that's the way to go about it. But when the law is there, it's there. You just have to mobilize for a review based on research and analysis.
Maybe I can add on to what Nafi's just said around research and analysis. I think if that research can be pointing to that business case. So how do we have research, or can we find research? Can we undertake research to show that where companies are engaging in benefit sharing and doing these investments really thoughtfully, that 5, 10 years down the line, they actually have better returns. They have more stable communities. They have more stable business operations. I think that's the one thing from a risk mitigation perspective. And then I think from a business development perspective, if you take into account that many of the renewable energy companies their customers are emerging economies. And their ability, and with a sound track record, they're able to bring about not just clean, affordable energy in these emerging economies, but also the other requirements of the emerging economies, which is economic and social development. And if you can show that these companies are contributing to that and therefore winning more business, then you have a real business case. And as we know, business follows the money. So if you can show that they can earn the money, then you've got them following the regulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yumna. So we have now reached the end of this webinar. I think we heard from all speakers that there's a need to center local communities and their needs in direct benefit sharing frameworks. And there's also a critical need to have strong legal and regulatory frameworks in place and creating the condition for capacitation of communities to engage into those negotiations, but also capacitation of state agencies. And that, of course, this is not a silver bullet to all the type of human rights abuses and issues that are happening in the extraction of transition minerals and renewable energy deployment as the world is navigating this challenge, but that this can be a part of the toolkit that we need to put in place to achieve the objective of shared prosperity, supporting a just energy transition. So once again, thank you so much to all speakers. Thank you so much to all participants as well. And of course, last but not least, thanks to the BHRC staff who worked today to organize this webinar, Joe, Elodie, Anna, Harriet, Sophie, and Mev. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.